She spoke Hindi to calm her nerves, unaware the Duke could understand every word. The afternoon light was the cruelest thing about Lady Darlington's music room. Elena Valentine had noticed this on her first visit, 8 months ago. When she had stood in almost exactly this same position near the tall windows and discovered that the English sun, pale and watery as it was, had a particular talent for illuminating precisely what one most wished to hide. It found the olive undertone in her skin that no amount of rice powder could fully suppress. It traced the architecture of her cheekbones, too high, too defined, shaped by a woman who had grown up under a fiercer sky. It made her hair, though pinned with meticulous care, look darker than was fashionable, darker than was comfortable. Darker than anything that belonged in this particular room. She pressed her palm flat against the window glass. The cold helped around her. The daughters of earls and viscounts arranged themselves in the graceful postures of women who had never needed to think about their posture. Their muslins were white and ivory and the palest of blues, colors that required a certain kind of skin to carry properly. A fact none of them would ever say aloud because none of them had ever needed to say it. Their jewelry caught the thin afternoon light and scattered it into small, satisfied fires. They laughed at intervals. The laughter of people entirely at ease within their own walls. Elena had chosen lavender today. Lavender was English. Lavender suggested gardens and propriety and nothing whatsoever about bazaars perfumed with cardamom. Or monsoon rains turning the red Calcutta earth into something that smelled like the beginning of the world. Lavender said, "I belong here. I have always belonged here. There is nowhere else I have ever belonged." She had become quite skilled at saying things without speaking. "Miss Valentine." Lady Darlington's voice crossed the room with the precision of a woman who had spent 40 years ensuring that her voice always ca right exactly as far as she intended. "How very pleasant that your uncle permits you to join us. One does feel that exposure to refined company can only be beneficial." The room did not quite go silent, that would have been too obvious, but the quality of its noise shifted. Teacups were held at slightly different angles. Eyes moved. Elena understood the architecture of such sentences. Lady Darlington was not saying "you do not belong here." She was saying something far more elegant: "Your presence here is an act of generosity on our part. And you would do well to remember it." The distinction mattered enormously. One could argue with an insult. One could not argue with charity without appearing ungrateful. Lady Darlington. Elena kept her voice level, her consonants precise. "You are most kind." She had spent 5 years perfecting the English cadence. In Calcutta, her father had spoken to her in the clipped, efficient English of a man who worked for the company. Her mother had spoken to her in the warm, round syllables of a language that seemed to understand sorrow better than English ever could. When her parents died, her mother of fever, her father of the grief that comes when the thing that made life bearable is gone, Elena had been sent to London with 2 trunks. A letter of introduction to her uncle, and the understanding that she was to make herself as little trouble as possible. She had managed it. Mostly. She had flattened her vowels and straightened her spine and learned which topics of conversation to avoid and which expressions to maintain and how to occupy space in a room in a way that made her easy to overlook. She had become, through sheer determined effort, the kind of woman people forgot was in the room until they needed someone to fill a seat. Lady Darlington was still speaking. Something about the civilizing influence of structured social engagement. Something about Christian duty. Elena let the words wash over her and watched the light move on the polished floor. At the far end of the room, a girl named Miss Harkis Leopardy, golden-haired, possessed of exactly the sort of bloodline that required no defense, was performing a piece on the pianoforte. She played adequately. Everyone said she played beautifully, which was a different thing. But no one in this room trafficked in different things. Elena's fingers pressed harder against the glass. She felt the familiar sensation beginning, not panic, precisely, but its more manageable cousin. The sense of being pinned, observed, found wanting at some cellular level that no amount of lavender muslin could address. Her heart had taken up a faster rhythm sometime in the last 10 minutes, and she had learned that if she didn't address it quickly, it would escalate into something visible. And visible was the one thing she could not afford to be. She turned slightly away from the room, angling her face toward the window, toward the cool glass, toward the grey-white English sky that looked nothing like any sky she had grown up under, and she whispered, barely moving her lips. In the only language that had ever asked nothing of her, Shanti Rako. Sab thik haga. Bas thodi dur, or, keep calm. Everything will be all right. Just a little longer, her mother's words. Her mother's voice, reconstructed from memory. Slightly worn at the edges now after 5 years of frequent use. She could still hear the particular quality of the way it curved around certain consonants. The way it made Shanti sound like something you could actually hold in your hands. The music continued. Lady Darlington had moved on to a discussion of someone's unfortunate recent engagement. Elena breathed. She did not hear the door, she did not hear the butler's announcement. Which came a moment later, because the pianoforte covered it and her own pulse covered that. She did not notice the shift in the room's attention, the subtle reorientation of bodies. The sudden careful adjustments of posture, because she was still watching the English sky and telling herself that everything would be all right, just a little longer. Just a little. A shadow fell across the glass from behind her, not the shadow of the room. Something else. Someone standing close enough that she could feel, without turning, the displacement of air. The presence of something large and quiet at her back, and then a voice, low. Close. Unhurried. Speaking in a language that no one else in this room could possibly speak, Shanti to hi. Lekin tumharadil abibi tez dadak raha hi. Elena turned. He was not what she had expected. She had not, in truth, been expecting anything. She had been expecting an empty space at her back, the window, the grey sky. Her own reflection. The voice had been so impossible that for a full second after she turned, Elena's mind simply refused to process what she was seeing. A man. Tall. Broader in the shoulder than the doorframe had seemed to require. His coat was the unremarkable dark blue of someone who dressed for function rather than impression. Though the cut was precise enough to suggest that function and expense were not mutually exclusive. His hair was the color of strong tea, and his face. His face had been weathered. Not aged. Not marked by time in the way that soft indoor living left its mark on the men of her uncle's acquaintance. This was something else. A face that had been outside, under real sun. In real weather. A face that had learned to hold its expression still in circumstances where expression was a liability. His eyes were grey. The particular grey of the sky over the Bay of Bengal at the beginning of the monsoon season. When the clouds built themselves into enormous structures and the air turned electric with the promise of what was coming. He was looking at her as if he had expected to find her exactly here, in exactly this state. With exactly those words still dissipating in the air between them, Elena became aware of several things in rapid succession. The first was that the room had gone very quiet, the second was that Lady Darlington had risen from her chair, the third was that the man standing before her had just spoken to her in fluent, unhurried Hindi, not the halting Hindi of a man who had learned a few phrases for convenience, but the Hindi of someone who had lived inside the language, who understood not just its grammar but its particular tenderness. The way it softened certain truths, and that he had specifically responded to the words she had whispered under her breath, which meant he had heard them, which meant she had not been, as she had believed for 5 years. Entirely alone in the practice, her mouth did not cooperate with any of the responses she was attempting to formulate. Around them, the assembled company watched with expressions ranging from polite confusion to barely concealed fascination. They had heard syllables. Foreign syllables. The kind that came back in letters from husbands stationed in places that appeared on maps but never quite became real. They had no idea what had been said. They knew only that the Duke of Ashdown for Lady Darlington was already moving across the room with the focused energy of a woman who had been waiting for this arrival, had walked directly past every other person in the music room and addressed himself to the half-Indian girl standing at the window, "Your Grace." Lady Darlington reached them, slightly breathless. Reconstructing her smile from its collapse. What an extraordinary honor. We had not, that is. We had hoped. Lady Darlington. The Duke turned to acknowledge their hostess with the measured courtesy of a man who had been performing courtesy since childhood and had long ago separated the performance from any particular feeling. "Forgive the intrusion. I had business in the street and saw your carriage." He paused. "And I wish to pay my respects." His gaze, as he said this, moved fractionally back toward Elena. Lady Darlington's smile recalibrated itself. Elena watched the woman's eyes move between the Duke and herself with an expression that was trying very hard to be gracious and not quite managing it. Of course. "Allow me is you know Miss Hardcastle?" "Naturally, and Lady Pemberton's daughters, Anne." "Miss Valentine." The Duke said her name before Lady Darlington reached her in the sequence of introductions. Not a question. A statement, in English. In the same unhurried register he had used for the Hindi. "I believe we have not been formally introduced." The room was very quiet now. Elena found her voice somewhere in the vicinity of her sternum, where it had apparently retreated during the preceding 30 seconds. "We have not." "Your Grace." Her consonants were perfect. She was proud of that. "Elena Valentine, James Ashworth," he said. "Ashdown." He said the title the way men said things they had not chosen accurately, without embellishment. His eyes did not leave hers. "You were stationed in Calcutta." "I understand." "Your father worked for the company." The question was not a question, which meant he already knew the answer, which meant he had known who she was before he walked across this room. Which meant. Elena did not let herself follow that thought to its conclusion. Not here. Not in front of Lady Darlington, whose expression had settled into the particular frozen configuration of a hostess watching a social event proceed in a direction she had not planned that he did. Elena kept her voice level. "He passed some years ago. I have been in London since that I know." Something moved briefly in his expression. Not pity. She would have recognized pity. She had been the recipient of enough of it in 5 years to identify its particular texture immediately. This was something else. Something she didn't have a word for in English. In Hindi, perhaps. But. "Your Grace." Lady Darlington had regathered herself. "Might I offer you tea? And Miss Hardcastle has been playing the most wonderful. Miss Valentine." The Duke had not finished. "Your father surveyed the Hughley River trading routes in 1808. His documentation was used by the company for the better part of a decade." He said this as if he were stating a simple fact. The color of the sky, the date of a treaty, and indeed it was a simple fact. It was simply not a fact that anyone in this room had ever mentioned before, not to Elena, not in her presence. Not as anything other than an administrative detail in her father's letter of employment. His work was precise. It was useful. I relied on it myself. During my time there, the room remained very quiet. Elena looked at this man who had just spoken her mother's language and her father's legacy in the same sentence, and she felt something shift in her chest. Not the pleasant flutter of romance novels. Something deeper and more disorienting. The sensation of a foundation she had believed to be settled, revealing that it had not, in fact, been entirely fixed. "That I did not know," she said, very carefully, "that his work was known, that it was known to those who needed to know it." He held her gaze for a moment longer. Then, with the same unhurried precision he seemed to bring to all things. "I am holding a gathering at Ashdown Park in 3 weeks' time. A house party. Me mother's insistence." The very faintest inflection suggested an entire silent conversation about his mother's insistence. "I would be glad if you and your family would attend. I will send a formal card." That he said this to Elena. Not to the room. Not to Lady Darlington, who was standing 18 inches to his left with an expression that had moved beyond frozen into something approaching alabaster. To Elena, specifically. In the same direct and unembellished manner in which he had said everything else, "Your Grace." Elena heard her own voice as if from a slight distance. "I am not certain." "I am." He said it simply, without drama. The way one states something that requires no defense because it is simply the case. 3 weeks. My secretary will send the details. That he turned to Lady Darlington. He thanked her for her hospitality with a sentence that managed to be both perfectly courteous and entirely final. He acknowledged Ms. S. Hardcastle's playing. He left. The door had barely closed before the room exhaled. Lady Darlington turned to Elena. Her expression had finished its journey through frozen and alabaster and arrived somewhere harder and more precise. Miss Valentine, she said, in a tone that had abandoned all pretense of warmth. What an extraordinary coincidence. Elena understood that this was not a statement about coincidence. Around the room, she felt the realignment of attention from curious to hostile. The subtle closing of ranks that she had grown familiar with in the weeks after any occasion when someone who mattered had treated her as if she mattered. She was the entertainment now. She was the question that needed answering. The irregularity that needed explaining. She pressed her fingers against the cool glass one more time. Shanti Rocco, she thought, and for the first time in 5 years. The voice in her head was not quite alone. Her aunt was waiting in the front hall when Elena returned. This was not unusual. Mrs. Clarence Valentine, her uncle's wife. A woman who had married into mild respectability and defended it with the vigilance of someone who understood exactly how easily it could be lost, had a talent for appearing in doorways at moments of maximum inconvenience. She stood now with her hands folded and her expression arranged into the part 1. Killer configuration that meant she had already received some account of the afternoon's events and was prepared to be displeased about it. Lady Darlington's footman came, she said. Before Elena had finished removing her bonnet. He said the Duke of Ashdown spoke to you. At length. He introduced himself. Elena set her bonnet on the hall table. He knew my father's work. That he spoke to you in a foreign language. Elena kept her hands still. He has spent time in India. He spoke to you, her aunt repeated, with the emphasis of someone filing a document, in a foreign language, in front of Lady Darlington's entire company. And then invited you to his house party. She paused. You are to understand what that looks like. Elena understood precisely what it looked like. She had been understanding what things looked like for 5 years. She was, by this point, something of an expert. That I have not yet accepted. You will not accept. Her aunt moved into the sitting room with the air of someone concluding rather than beginning a discussion. Elena followed, because the alternative was standing alone in the hall, which would accomplish nothing. Men of his position do not single out young women of your. Her aunt paused, selecting a word with care. Situation for innocent reasons. Whatever he wants from you. It is not the pleasure of your company at a house party. You don't know what he wants. That I know what men want. Elena. Her aunt sat. And I know what you are in their estimation. You are a curiosity. An exotic variety of English girl. The kind of woman a certain type of man finds interesting for a season. Before he marries someone appropriate and the interesting season is quietly forgotten. The words landed with the flat accuracy of something that had been rehearsed. Or perhaps simply thought so many times that it had worn itself into certainty. Elena sat in a chair across from her aunt and looked at the cold fireplace. His secretary will send a formal card. She said, send it back, and insult a duke. Her aunt's expression shifted slightly. This was the argument she could not dismiss, and they both knew it. Her uncle's position minor, precarious. Dependent on the goodwill of people considerably more powerful than himself, did not accommodate the luxury of insulting dukes. Sending back a formal invitation from the Duke of Ashdown would be noticed. It would be discussed. It would create a different kind of problem than the one her aunt was trying to prevent. The silence stretched between them, the silence of two people arriving at the same conclusion from opposite directions. Be careful, her aunt said. Finally. It was the closest thing to permission she was capable of offering. Elena looked at the cold fireplace and said nothing. That night she sat on the edge of her bed with the small wooden box that had traveled with her from Calcutta. Inside it, a folded square of cotton printed with the pattern her mother had called kanta, running stitches in red and gold that had taken 3 months to complete. A pressed flower from a tree that did not grow in England. 2 letters, still sealed. That her father had written and never sent to people she had never met. She did not open the box. She only held it. Shanti Rocco, she told herself, her mother's voice, thinner than it used to be. Worn at the edges, the formal card arrived the following morning, along with a separate envelope that contained a single folded sheet of paper. No signature. 4 words, in Hindi, in handwriting that was precise and slightly angular. The handwriting of someone who had learned the script as an adult and had worked at it with the same systematic effort they brought to everything else. Anna Chahi Agar Dil Main, you should come. If your heart agrees. Elena read it 3 times. Then she folded it very carefully and placed it inside the wooden box, next to the contact cloth, next to the pressed flower, next to the letters that had never been sent that I in the morning. She wrote her acceptance. Ashdown Park arrived the way all great houses arrived for people who had never seen them, suddenly. After a long approach through grounds that had been designed to make the arrival feel inevitable, the carriage that had collected Elena and her uncle's family from London was the finest vehicle she had ever ridden in. And she had spent most of the journey watching the countryside through the window and trying not to think about what she was doing or why she had agreed to do it. Her aunt sat across from her in pointed silence. Her uncle read correspondence. Her 2 young cousins, who had also been included in the invitation, a fact that had temporarily softened her aunt's opposition, talked quietly between themselves. The house was grey stone and tall windows, surrounded by the kind of grounds that required an entire separate staff just to maintain their appearance of effortlessness. Other carriages were already in the drive. Elena watched women in silks and expensive muslins descend with the assurance of people arriving at a place they had every right to arrive at, and she straightened her spine and kept her face still and reminded herself that she had managed worse situations than this. The butler met them at the door with professional composure. Inside, the entrance hall had the overwhelming quality of rooms that had never needed to justify themselves to anyone. High ceilings painted in the Italianate style, floors that reflected light like still water, portraits ascending the staircase in a line that established, very quietly, that this family had been here for a very long time. The other guests had gathered in the drawing room. Elena heard the voices before she reached the door, the particular pitch of a social gathering at its early stages. People performing ease for one another's benefit. She did not see the Duke immediately when she entered. She saw Lady Fontaine first, a tall, sharp-featured woman in bronze silk who was already positioned in the room's most advantageous chair, and Lady Fontaine's daughter Cecily, who was the kind of beautiful that seemed to have been constructed with specific architectural intent. She saw Beatrice Ellsworth, who caught Elena's eye from across the room and gave her a small, genuine nod that Elena filed away as potentially important. She saw approximately 20 other people, all of whom registered her entrance with varying degrees of visible calculation. The Duke was standing near the far windows, speaking with an older gentleman about something that required a map, apparently, because there was one unrolled on the table between them. He looked up when she entered. That he looked up before the butler announced her name. Elena noticed this and decided not to think about it. Miss Valentine. He crossed the room with the same unhurried directness he had employed at Lady Darling. No performance of surprise, no elaborate social navigation. He simply came to where she was, as if this were the obvious and logical thing to do. You came that I said I would. People say many things. Something moved briefly in his expression. I am glad you kept your word. He turned to her uncle, performed the necessary introductions with efficient courtesy, and then said, in a tone that was not quite casual, I hope to show Miss Valentine the greenhouse this afternoon, if she is not too tired from the journey. It occurred to me she might find the collection of interest. Her aunt's eyes moved to Elena with a very specific sharpness. Of course, her uncle said, with the reflexive agreeableness of a man who had not yet caught up with the conversation. Delightful. The greenhouse was at the east end of the property, connected to the main house by a glass corridor that admitted the thin afternoon light and trapped it. Elena followed the Duke through the corridor and into the first chamber and stopped at it. Was not an English greenhouse, that is to say. It was an English greenhouse in the technical sense: glass walls, controlled temperature, the faint smell of earth and moisture, and something organic and green. But the plants inside it were not English plants. Or rather, they were not only English plants. Among the roses and the ferns and the modest decorative shrubs that she had expected, there were other things. Things with broader leaves and deeper greens, things that grew in the particular insistent way of plants accustomed to more generous sunlight. Things that smelled. She stood very still. Imlay, she said, before she had decided to speak, the tamarind tree was smell. It would not survive an English winter without the controlled environment of the greenhouse, but it was unmistakably itself. The feathery leaves. The particular curve of the branches, the way it held itself with a kind of patient tropical stubbornness in the face of an entirely inappropriate climate, Imlay, the Duke confirmed. From beside her. His Hindi had the slight formal quality of a language learned with discipline rather than absorbed in childhood, but it was accurate, and the words sat naturally in his mouth. He moved along the row. Haldi. The turmeric. Tulsi. Holy basil. Growing in a clay pot that looked like it had traveled a significant distance. Keela. The banana plant, small and determined. Its broad leaves catching the greenhouse light. Elena walked slowly between them. She touched the tulsi leaf with one finger and brought it to her nose, and the smell was so precisely and entirely itself that for a moment the greenhouse walls receded and there was just the smell and the memory of a courtyard in Calcutta where her mother had kept a tulsi plant by the door and touched it every morning. She did not cry. She had learned not to. Where did you get them? She asked. When she trusted her voice, some I brought back. Some I obtained through the Botanical Society. He paused beside the tamarind tree. Some were given to me by people I knew there, when I left. As a way of he stopped. Considered. As a way of making sure I did not forget. Did you need reminding? He looked at the tamarind tree for a moment before answering. No, he said. But I needed to be able to prove it to myself, sometimes. That it had been real. Elena looked at him. He was not looking at her, he was looking at the tree with an expression she recognized. Because she had worn its approximate shape herself on a number of occasions. The expression of someone checking that something still exists. Neem, she said, to see if he knew it. Neem. He pointed to the far end of the row. Where a neem tree occupied a large terracotta pot with the air of something that had opinions about its situation but was making the best of it. My gardener believes it is possessed. It survived last winter when everything else in this section died. He has decided this is suspicious. Elena laughed. It came out before she could stop it, not a polite, managed laugh, but a real one, short and surprised and entirely her own. The Duke turned to look at her. His expression had shifted into something she had not seen on his face before. Something that sat oddly against the careful weathered stillness of his features. She thought it might be pleasure. Not performance of pleasure. Actual pleasure, the kind that catches a person slightly off guard. Neem ace high hoda high, she said. Neem is like that, Han. He agreed. Yes. And then. After a pause, tell me what you remember about the rains. That it was an odd request. Not, tell me about Calcutta, tell me about your family. Tell me something useful I can verify. Tell me what you remember about the rains. As if the precise meteorological data were irrelevant and what he wanted was the texture of the thing. The private sensory record that no official account would contain. Elena sat down on the low stone bench that ran along the greenhouse wall. Outside the glass, the English afternoon continued its grey proceedings. Inside. The tulsi was growing and the tamarind was being stubborn, and the neem had apparently decided to survive out of sheer disagreement with its circumstances. The first rain of the season, she said, slowly. Smelled like iron and earth and something sweet underneath. My mother said it smelled like the city breathing. She paused. The sound weighs. It wasn't like English rain. English rain apologizes for itself. Indian rain does not. The Duke sat on the bench at the other end. He did not speak. By the third day, she continued, the streets had rivers in them. Not flooding, exactly. Just water finding its way. Taking up the space it wanted. We'd put brass pots outside to catch the runoff from the roof. My mother called it amrit. Nectar. She said God was washing the dust off the world. She stopped. The greenhouse was very quiet, holding the warmth of a sun that wasn't English. And two people who were speaking a language that did not belong in this county, in this country, in this century's version of what English people were supposed to care about. The last rains I saw, the Duke said, after a moment, were in 09. Before I was recalled. He said the word recalled with the same uninflected precision he used for the title Ashton, accurately, without embellishment. Without complaint. I stood on the roof of the mission house in Calcutta and watched it come across the bay. It moved like something alive. Like something that knew where it was going, that it does. Elena said. Barish ko rasta pata hoda hai. Rain always knows its way. That he turned to look at her. She turned to look at him. The greenhouse held its warmth around them, and the tulsi grew, and for a long, entirely quiet moment, Elena Valentine sat in an English house and felt, for the first time in 5 years, that she was not performing anything at all. Breakfast at Ashdown Park was served in a room that caught the morning light from 3 directions, which meant there was nowhere to hide from it. Elena had arrived early, hoping to settle herself before the rest of the party descended. This strategy had failed. Lady Fontaine was already present. Positioned at the table's midpoint with the precision of someone who had surveyed the terrain the previous evening and selected her ground accordingly. Cecily sat beside her mother in a morning dress of pale yellow that managed to be both modest and carefully considered. 3 other young women had arranged themselves in the adjacent seats. The table had a clear geography, and Elena understood, without needing it explained, that the seat at the far end nearest the door, furthest from the windows, was the seat that had been designated for her. She had nearly reached it when the Duke entered. That he came from the side door, the one that connected to the estate office, carrying a sheaf of correspondence that he set on the sideboard without ceremony. He was dressed for the morning in a way that suggested he had already been awake for several hours doing things that were not decorative. He surveyed the table with the brief, comprehensive attention of a man who assessed situations as a professional reflex. His gaze moved to Elena, then to the empty seat at the far end, then to Lady Fontaine, who had not quite managed to arrange her expression into innocence before he looked at her. Miss Valentine. He said her name the way he said most things, without preamble, as if arriving at the point were simply more efficient than approaching it. Please sit here. He indicated the chair to his left. The chair that had not been set for her. The chair that was, in the geometry of this particular table and this particular gathering. The chair that meant something. Lady Fontaine's cup paused halfway to her lips. Elena walked to the indicated chair and sat in it. She kept her back straight and her face composed and did not look at Lady Fontaine. Miss Valentine, the Duke said, settling into his own chair and reaching for the coffee pot with the air of someone for whom this was simply the continuation of a morning, has been in correspondence with the Asiatic Society regarding her father's survey work. I understand they are considering a formal publication of his Hughley River documentation. He poured his coffee. This strikes me as overdue. The work was used for years without proper attribution. That he said this to the table, to no one in particular, in the same tone in which one might mention the weather, or comment on the quality of the toast. The silence that followed had a specific texture. Not the silence of people who had nothing to say. The silence of people recalibrating. Cecily looked at her plate. 2 of the other young women exchanged a glance. Beatrice Ellsworth, seated further down the table, brought her napkin briefly to her mouth in a way that might have been concealing something. How interesting, said Lady Fontaine, in a tone that suggested she found it the opposite. One does admire dedication to scholarship. Though I wonder whether publication is quite the Society's standards are rigorous, the Duke said, without looking up from his correspondence. I imagine they would not have expressed interest if the work did not merit it. He turned a page. The eggs are particularly good this morning. Mrs. Carroll has a talent for them. The subject was closed. Not aggressively. Not with the theatrical finality of a man making a point. Simply closed, the way one closes a door when one has finished with a room. With the easy assumption of someone who has never had to wonder whether the door would do what he intended, Elena reached for her own coffee. Her hand was steady. Across the table, Beatrice Ellsworth caught her eye and gave her a look that communicated, quite efficiently, that Beatrice had been watching Lady Fontaine try to manage this gathering since yesterday afternoon and was finding the morning's development satisfying. "Your Grace," Elena said, because it seemed important to say something that was hers rather than only receiving. "I should tell you that the Society's interest was preliminary. Nothing has been confirmed that it will be." He said this without looking up. Then, after a moment, he did look up, briefly. With the grey eyes that she had decided did not belong in England any more than Tulsi did. "Your father's work was good. It should have been acknowledged at the time. It wasn't. These things can be corrected." He returned to his correspondence. Elena looked at her plate and thought about her father, who had died in a rented room in Calcutta with his survey notebook stacked beside the bed, never knowing that anyone who mattered had noticed, she thought. You should not let yourself feel this. She felt it anyway. The morning dispersed into the various activities that house parties deployed to fill the hours between meals. A writing party assembled for those who wished it. Several guests gravitated toward the music room. Lady Fontaine organized a CA.RD party in the blues salon with the efficiency of someone establishing a secondary command position. Elena walked in the long gallery with Beatrice Ellsworth, who had attached herself to Elena's company after breakfast with the frank purposefulness of someone who had decided something and was acting on it. "Lady Fontaine is going to make your life very difficult," Beatrice said. Not unpleasantly. She was examining a portrait of a 17th-century Ashworth with her head tilted at a slight angle. "She arrived here with a plan and you are not in it that I am aware. She's been telling people that the Duke invited you as a." Beatrice paused, selecting her word. "Curiosity. A novelty from the colonial experiment. She says he collects odd things. Apparently you are an odd thing. That's one interpretation. It isn't correct." Beatrice moved to the next portrait. "I have been watching him watch you. And that is not how a man looks at a curiosity." She glanced at Elena sideways. "That is how a man looks at something he has been trying to find for a long time and is somewhat unsettled to have found." Elena said nothing. "You don't have to tell me anything." Beatrice said. "I am not asking. I am only telling you what I observe, because I think you are the sort of person who is better equipped with accurate information than without it." She paused. "Also, Lady Fontaine is almost certainly going to do something unpleasant before the week is out. And I thought you should have at least one person in this house who is straightforwardly on your side." Elena looked at this woman, the daughter of a viscount, red-haired and precise and apparently without any interest in performing her good intentions, and felt something she had not felt since Calcutta, the particular warmth of uncomplicated goodwill freely offered. "Thank you," she said. Beatrice nodded, as if this were a transaction now concluded. "Now, tell me about India. I have read 3 books about it and I suspect they were all wrong about nearly everything." Elena almost laughed. "Which 3? The ones that described it as mysterious?" Beatrice said. "They all used that word." "I distrust that word considerably." "You should," Elena said. And then, because it had been 5 years since anyone had asked her to describe India as a place rather than a problem. "It isn't mysterious. It's just specific. Very particular about its own details. The rain comes at a specific time. The light at a specific angle. The food is precise. Things have names that mean something as opposed to English things. English things have names that point at other names." Elena said. "Indian things have names that point at the things themselves." Beatrice considered this. "Imli," she said, with the careful pronunciation of someone who had been listening. "The Duke said that at breakfast, to the gardener. About the tree in the greenhouse. I noticed." Elena looked at her. "I told you." Beatrice said mildly. "I have been watching." Lady Fontaine made her move on the 3rd afternoon. It was done with the technique of someone who had learned that the most effective attacks were the ones that appeared to be something else. She chose the drawing room, after tea. When the maximum number of guests were present and the light had reached the particular flatness that made everything in the room look as it actually was rather than as anyone wished it to appear, she did not address Elena directly. She addressed the room. "That I find myself concerned," Lady Fontaine said, in the tone of someone performing reluctance very carefully, "that we may have placed His Grace in a somewhat delicate position. Socially speaking." She paused to let the room lean in. Several people did. A man in his position relies on the judgment of his peers. And there has been. She settled her cup in its saucer with quiet precision. "Some discussion of what?" Beatrice said, from across the room. "Of the Duke's recent attentions." Lady Fontaine's gaze moved briefly to Elena, then away. As if the connection were self-evident and therefore required no belaboring. One understands that his time abroad may have adjusted his perspective on certain matters. But those of us who have his reputation at heart must consider how these things appear. The room was very quiet in the way of rooms. Waiting for something to happen, Elena felt the structure of it with precise clarity. The implication was not that she had done anything wrong. The implication was that her existence, her specific, half-Indian, inconvenient existence, was itself an imposition on the Duke's respectability. Lady Fontaine was not accusing her. Lady Fontaine was expressing concern. The distinction made it very nearly unanswerable. She was composing a response, the kind of response that was measured and composed and entirely contract. When the door from the corridor opened, the Duke had not been expected. He had, as far as anyone knew, been in the estate office all afternoon. He stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the room's specific silence with the attention of someone accustomed to walking into situations mid-development. "Lady Fontaine," he said. His voice was its usual unhurried self. But there was something in the register of it that had changed. "I believe I heard my name." Lady Fontaine's recovery was admirable. "Your Grace. We were only expressing our collective hope that you are finding the party to your satisfaction." "That I am." He entered the room and stood, without sitting, in the way of someone who intended to remain only briefly. "I also understand that my satisfaction has been a topic of some discussion in my absence. I appreciate the interest." He let that sit for a moment. "I should mention, since it seems relevant, that Miss Valentine's father produced the Hughley River survey documentation that my Eastern delegation has relied upon for the last 7 years. Without it, we would have negotiated 2 of our Bengal trade agreements without accurate geographical data. The consequences would have been significant." That he said this pleasantly, informatively, in the manner of someone sharing a relevant fact. "Furthermore, her father's personal correspondence, which Miss Valentine has allowed me to review, contains observations about the northeastern trading routes that the company's own surveyors missed entirely. I have written to the Asiatic Society recommending formal publication and full attribution." He paused. "I note this because there appears to be some confusion about why Miss Valentine is here. She is here because I invited her. I invited her because she is the most informed person I know regarding a region of significant strategic importance. And because her father's work deserves to be known by people capable of understanding its value." He looked at Lady Fontaine. The look was not hostile. It was, in some ways, worse than hostile. It was the look of someone who had simply declined to pretend that a pretense was not occurring. "That I hope that clarifies matters," he said. Lady Fontaine said, "Of course. Your Grace." Her voice was the voice of a woman placing something very carefully down on a surface so it did not break. The Duke looked across the room to Elena. Something passed between them, not a smile, precisely, but the movement toward one. Then he said, "Miss Valentine, I believe we were to discuss the Northeastern correspondence this afternoon, if you are available." Elena stood. "I am available, Your Grace." She walked across the room without looking at Lady Fontaine. She was aware, in the peripheral register of someone who had spent 5 years reading rooms, of exactly how the 30 seconds of her crossing were received. She was aware of Lady Fontaine's stillness and Cecily's downcast eyes and Beatrice Ellsworth's expression, which had settled into something that looked like quiet satisfaction. She was aware, most precisely, of the exact moment she reached the doorway and the Duke stepped aside to let her through, not the gesture of a host managing a guest, but the gesture of someone making room for a person who had every right to the space that I in the corridor, out of the room's sight. She stopped, that was she began, accurate. He said, you know that's not what I mean. That he looked at her. Your father's work was genuinely useful. Everything I said was true, that I know. But you said it in that room, at that moment, for a reason. That he was quiet for a moment. Lady Fontaine has been managing this gathering since she arrived, he said. She is skilled at it. She understands that the most effective way to remove someone from a room is to make their presence seem costly to the person who invited them. He paused. I find I am not interested in allowing that particular strategy to succeed. Elena looked at him in the flat aft renowned light of the corridor, this man who had spoken her mother's language in the most English room she had ever stood in, who kept a tamarind tree alive in the wrong climate out of stubbornness or grief or something she still did not have a name for, shall try again. Elena said, she will, and the things she implies about my blood, my background, they won't stop. No then. Then I will be accurate again, he said simply. As many times as necessary. Elena looked at her hands. The light in the corridor was doing nothing kind to the olive tone of her skin, and she noticed, with a slight shock, that she did not care. Apka Shukriya, she said quietly. Thank you. He said. Koi bat nahi. It is nothing. She shook her head. It isn't nothing. That he did not answer that. But the quality of his silence was different from the silence of someone who had nothing to say. It was the silence of someone who understood that certain things were better received without addition. They walked toward the library, and the afternoon light followed them down the corridor. And in the drawing room behind them the party slowly reconstituted its conversation around the absence they had left in it. The ballroom at Ashdown Park had been designed by someone who understood that candlelight was not decoration but architecture. It did not illuminate the rooms so much as Bill D. constructing walls of warm gold out of the darkness beyond the windows, making the polished floor into a second sky in which the dancers moved like reflections of themselves. The musicians were stationed in the upper gallery, and the sound came down from above in a way that seemed less like music being played and more like music simply being present, the way rain was present, or the smell of the sea. Elena stood near the east wall and watched the room arrange itself. She had dressed with particular care, which she recognized as a form of armor. Her gown was deep green, not the fashionable pale green of the season, but something darker and more definite, a color that did not apologize for itself. Her mother's ivory comb, the one she had brought from Calcutta and never worn in public, held her hair at the back of her head. It was a small decision. It was the kind of small decision that felt, in the moment of making it, like something considerably larger. Beatrice found her within the first quarter hour and stood beside her with a glass of ratafia and the air of a woman who had come prepared for an interesting evening. Lady Fontaine, Beatrice said quietly, without looking at the subject of her observation, has told at least 4 people that the Duke invited you as an object lesson in colonial philanthropy. That I heard. She also told Mrs. Hardcastle that you have been angling for private interviews with him. The library, Elena said, and the greenhouse, both of which he arranged. Beatrice sipped her drink. She knows that. She is choosing to present the sequence differently. She paused. She is also, I note, positioned near the center of the room in a way that assumes the first dance. Elena looked. Lady Fontaine and Cecily had indeed established themselves in the room's social midpoint with the calm assurance of people who had done their geometry. Cecily was in white silk that caught the candlelight. Practiced effectiveness. She was beautiful and knew how to be beautiful in a room, which was a skill Elena had never acquired and was not certain she wanted. Shall get it, Elena said. The first dance. It's expected that I s it. Beatrice's tone suggested this was not a question. Elena started to respond, and then stopped. The Duke had entered from the far door. He was in evening black, which suited him in the way that evening black suited men who did not need the color to do anything for them. It simply confirmed what was already there. He made the brief, necessary circuit of the room's senior guests, exchanged a few sentences with his estate manager. accepted a glass of wine and set it on a nearby table without drinking from it. He moved through the room with the efficiency of a man who was present because it was required and intended to fulfill that requirement without excess. Then he stopped that he was on the far side of the room. Elena was on the east wall. There were approximately 40 people between them, and the musicians were beginning the opening notes of the first set. And Lady Fontaine had arranged herself and her daughter in the precise location from which it was most natural for the evening's host to approach. That he walked across the room to Elena, not through the crowd. Through the crowd would have been conspicuous. A performance of intention. He walked around the edge, along the wall, which was both more direct and somehow more deliberate. As if he had calculated the route that was least theatrical and most unambiguous and chosen it on purpose. Lady Fontaine watched him pass her. The musicians completed their opening phrase and paused, waiting. Miss Valentine. He stopped before her. Will you dance? The room did not go silent. Because rooms do not go silent at balls. The noise continued, the voices, the movement, the musicians' suspended breath. But Elena felt the shift in it, the quality of attention changing, 40 or 50 people redistributing their awareness toward this particular point on the map, she thought. This will have consequences, she thought. He knows that, she thought, looking at his face, which was not performing anything, not asking for anything, not calculating anything. Simply waiting with the patient certainty of someone who has decided that the consequence he was most interested in was the one that happened if she said no. Yes, she said that he offered his hand. She placed hers in it. They walked to the floor together, and the musicians, with the professional instinct of people who understood what they were watching, began. That he danced the way he did most things, with precise, controlled competence that had somewhere inside it, if you were paying attention, something that was not controlled at all. He held her at the correct distance. His hand at her back with a pressure that was formal and correct and somehow, through some quality she could not have named, entirely unlike formality. They moved together, and Elena, who had danced perhaps a dozen times in 5 years and not once with anyone who made it feel like anything, found that her feet remembered what her mind had forgotten. You're thinking about the room, he said quietly. It was not an accusation. The room is thinking about us. Yes, Lady Fontaine is watching. I know that it doesn't concern you. It concerns me considerably. He turned her. And for a moment they were facing the long mirror at the ballroom's end, and Elena saw them as the room saw them, his height, her darkness, the green dress, the candlelight doing what it did. But not, he continued, bringing her back, more than the alternative concerns me. What is the alternative? Not dancing with you. He said it without inflection, as if it were simply a calculation he had made and found unacceptable. Elena looked up at him. This close, in the candlelight. She could see the lines at the corners of his eyes, the lines of someone who had spent years in a climate that required squinting, that required shielding the face against a sun that meant business. She could see the precise place where his complexion, tanned from years of real weather, met the white of his cravat. Aaj ki rat tumhara dil kia keh raha hai, he said, very quietly. Under the music. What is your heart saying tonight? That it was not quite a question. It was the form of a question used when the answer is already suspected and what is wanted is not information but confirmation. Around them, the other dancers moved. Cecily was dancing with a viscount who was clearly delighted by the assignment. Lady Fontaine stood at the room's edge, very still, with the expression of someone revising a plan. Beatrice, Elena could see over the Duke's shoulder, was watching with an expression that had abandoned all pretense of neutral observation. Mui abibi dar lag raha hai, Elena said, barely above a breath. I am still afraid, main jantahun. He turned her through the music's turn. I know. Tell me what frightens you. She thought about answering with something manageable. The whispers, Lady Fontaine. The social arithmetic of her position. These were true. They were also not the thing she was most afraid of. That you see something in me, she said, that is connected to a place rather than to a person. That I remind you of something you lost. And when the resemblance fades. She stopped. That he was quiet for a full measure of the music. Wo jaga mui yad hai. He said finally. I remember that place. But it is not why you are here. Another measure. You are here because when you spoke in that room when you thought no one could hear you were completely yourself. I had not seen that in 5 years. In anyone. A pause. In myself, the music shifted into its fina. L phrase. They slowed with it that I have not answered your question, Elena said. No Meradil. She stopped again. Started again. My heart is saying that I am afraid and that I am here anyway. I don't know what that means. That I think it means something. He said. I think it means quite a lot. The music stopped. They separated, the correct distance re-established, and they stood facing each other in the candlelit room while around them the applause began and the next set was called and the evening continued. Elena looked at Cecily, who was not watching her but was watching the empty space just past her shoulder. She looked at Lady Fontaine, whose expression had moved beyond revision into something harder and more settled. She looked at Beatrice, who was applauding with slightly more energy than the dance strictly warranted. She looked at the Duke, who was looking at her with the grey monsoon eyes and the weathered face and the patience of someone who had decided something and was prepared to wait for the world to catch up. That is going to cause considerable trouble, she said. Yes. He agreed. You're not sorry. No. He offered her his arm to lead her off the floor. Are you? Elena thought about the wooden box with the contact cloth and the pressed flower and the letters never sent. She thought about the tamarind tree being stubborn in the wrong climate. She thought about her mother's voice, worn at the edges, reconstructed from memory, saying Shanti Rocco in the dark. No, she said. And she took his arm, and they walked off the floor together, and the room watched them go. She found the garden by following the cold. The ballroom had reached the temperature of a room that had been full of people and candlelight for 3 hours. And Elena had reached the temperature of a person who needed, with some urgency, to be somewhere that was not performing anything. She slipped out through the side door while Beatrice was engaged in an apparently comprehensive dismantling of a baronet's theories about agricultural reform, and followed the stone path around the east wing until the music from the ballroom became something she was hearing rather than something she was inside. The garden at night was a different country from the garden in daylight. The formal beds dissolved into suggestion. The paths became silver threads in the moonlight, and the greenhouse at the far end was a dark glass structure breathing its faint tropical warmth into the cold air. She stood on the path and breathed. Shanti Rocco, she told herself. But the voice was different tonight. Less a prayer, more a report. She was not certain when she had stopped being afraid in the acute, managed way she had been afraid for 5 years. The constant low-level monitoring of every room, every sentence, every person's expression. She was still afraid. She had told him that. But it had changed quality. Somehow, between the greenhouse and the ballroom and the moment on the dance floor when she had said I am afraid and I am here anyway and felt the truth of both halves equally, she heard the footstep on the path before she heard him. You left, the Duke said. From a few feet behind her. I needed air. He came to stand beside her on the path, not close enough to be improper, close enough to be present. They stood in the dark garden with the greenhouse ahead of them and the ballroom music behind them and the moon doing its impartial work overhead. Tell me about your mother, he said. Elena was quiet for a moment. No one had asked her that. In 5 years, in London. No one had asked her about her mother as a person rather than as an explanation. She was from Murshidabad, she said. Her father was a silk merchant. She met my father when he came to survey the trade routes north of Calcutta. He spoke terrible Bengali. She spoke adequate English. They managed. A pause. She taught me to read in Hindi and Bengali before I read in English. She thought. Elena stopped. She ought that if I knew 2 languages deeply, I would always have a place to stand, even if I could not always find the ground. That he was quiet beside her. She used to say Shanti Rocco to me, Elena said, when I was frightened. When my father's work took him away for months and the house was too quiet and I didn't know the names of the feelings I was having. She turned the ivory comb over in her hands, though she had not realized she had removed it. She died when I was 14. Fever. She was gone in a week. The garden held the silence. The last thing she said to me, Elena said, was in Hindi. She had been confused for 2 days, speaking sometimes in Bengali. Sometimes in nothing I could understand. And then, that last morning, she looked at me very clearly and she said Shanti Rako. Sab Thik Hoga. Keep calm. Everything will be all right. Elena looked at the ivory comb in her hands. I have been saying it to myself ever since. It is the last complete sentence she said to me. In 5 years in London it was the only she stopped, the only thing that was entirely hers. He said, yes, that he was quiet for a long moment. Beside her, his stillness was a different quality from the stillness of someone who had nothing to say. It was the stillness of someone receiving something carefully, the way one receives something that is being trusted to one's hands. I in Calcutta. He said, at last, there was a family I knew near the mission. The father was a zamindara landowner. He used to say. He paused, finding the Hindi, the language settling back into his mouth the way languages do when they have lived there, Ye desh sikata hai. Andarasi. He said it softly. This country teaches from the inside. Elena turned to look at him. I understood, eventually, what he meant, the Duke said. England teaches you what is expected. India taught me what was real. He paused. I have been trying, for 5 years. To remember what was real. The music from the ballroom drifted across the garden, smaller now, belonging to a different world. Elena looked at the ivory comb in her hands. Her mother's comb, worn smooth at the edges. Carved with the pattern her mother had called paisley but which Elena had always thought looked more like a mango seed, like something that contained inside itself the shape of what it might become. That I should go back, she said. Yes. Neither of them moved immediately. Tumhara dil kia chata hai. He said, quietly. Not the question from the dance floor. What is your heart saying? This was different. What does your heart want? Elena held the comb and looked at the greenhouse where the tamarind tree was being stubborn in the wrong climate. And thought about a woman in Murshidabad who had taught her daughter to stand in 2 places at once, and thought about what it would mean to stop dividing herself into the half that was permissible and the half that was not. That I don't know yet. She said. I'm still learning the question. That he accepted this. They walked back toward the ballroom separately, 5 minutes apart. And the garden kept what they had left in it. The Dowager Duchess of Ashdown had arrived on the 4th morning. Elena had seen her from the upper landing, a tall woman in black silk who descended from her carriage with the unhurried authority of someone who understood that the world would wait. She had James Ashworth's eyes, or rather he had hers, that particular grey, assessing and patient. That seemed to process information at a different speed than other people's eyes did. She moved through the entrance hall greeting her son with the compressed efficiency of a woman who had things to say and intended to say them in the correct order. Elena had retreated from the landing before the Dowager Duchess looked up. She had spent the remainder of the morning in the library with a volume of company correspondence that the Duke had set aside for her review dispatches from the Calcutta station between 1805 and 1812. The years when her father had been most actively surveying. Reading them was a strange experience, like finding a map of a country she had lived in but seen only from the ground. Now revealed from above. Her father's name appeared 3 times in the official records. Each time as a source. Never as an author. She was making notes in the margin of her own notebook when the door opened. The Dowager Duchess closed it behind her with the quiet click of someone who had decided. This conversation required privacy and had arranged for it without consulting the other participant, Miss Valentine. She did not sit immediately. She looked at Elena the way she had looked at the entrance hall, thoroughly, without embarrassment. As if assessment were simply a form of courtesy she was performing. I have wanted to speak with you since I arrived. I find I have been waiting for my son to arrange it, which was, on reflection, optimistic of me. Elena set down her pen. Your Grace, sit, please. I am going to sit. And it will be awkward if you don't. The Dowager Duchess took the chair across the reading table with the air of someone accustomed to chairs doing what she wanted. She looked at the spread of correspondence on the table. Your father's work. Company dispatches. I am cross-referencing his survey notes with the official record, and finding discrepancies, finding absences. Elena said. There is a difference. The Dowager Duchess looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite approval but was in the neighborhood of it. My son said you were precise. He used that word specifically. I have been wondering what he meant by it, that I don't know what he meant. I think you do. She settled back. He has mentioned you 4 times in correspondence over the past 2 months. This is remarkable because my son does not mention people in correspondence. He mentions problems, progress, and occasionally weather. People do not appear. She paused. You appeared. Elena kept her hand still on the table. That I am not here to threaten you, the Dowager Duchess said. With the directness of someone who understood that clarifying one's intentions was more efficient than allowing them to be misread. Lady Fontaine, I understand, has been managing that function adequately. I am here because I have a piece of information that I think you should have. And I find I am not certain my son will tell you himself, because he is very like his father in the specific matter of not saying the thing that most need saying until the moment has become, structurally, unavoidable. Elena waited. The Dowager Duchess looked at the window for a moment. Outside. The grounds were doing their composed, expensive business in the afternoon light. When my son was recalled from India in 1810, she said, the official account was a failed trade negotiation. A treaty with a northern principality that did not reach completion. This is true. As far as it goes. She paused. What it does not include is that the treaty failed because James refused to execute one of its provisions. Elena was quiet. The provision required the removal of a landowning family from their ancestral estate. The land was wanted for a company installation. The fam. Ely had occupied it for 200 years. The treaty required only James' signature on a transfer document, a formality, in practical terms, since the decision had been made above him. She stopped. He refused. The library held the silence that he was 31 years old. The Dowager Duchess continued. He had been in India for 6 years. He spoke the language. He knew the family. He had eaten in their house. She said this with the precision of someone recounting facts rather than constructing an argument. He wrote to the company that he would not sign a document requiring people to leave their home because it was convenient for commercial interests. He said. She reached into her sleeve and produced a folded letter, worn at the creases. I still have his letter to me from that month. He said. I have spent 6 years learning to understand a place by learning to hear what it says about itself. I will not sign my name to a document that says it is nothing. She set the letter on the table. She did not push it toward Elena. She simply placed it where it could be seen that he was recalled withy. End the month. There was no formal censure. He was a duke's heir, and the company was not interested in that particular conflict. But it was made clear that his diplomatic career was finished. She looked at Elena steadily. He came home. He was 20 years older than he had been when he left. In all the ways that matter. He spent the next 5 years being precisely what was required of him, because the alternative was not available and he had made his choice and understood its cost. Elena looked at the letter on the table. The handwriting was recognizable, the same precise, slightly angular script that had written Anna Chahi Agar Dilmain on the folded sheet in her wooden box. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Because you are afraid that you are a substitute, the Dowager Duchess said. With the directness of a woman who had arrived at the point she had come to make. That what he feels for you is a feeling about India, about the years he lost. About the version of himself that existed there. That you are a container for something that has nothing to do with you. Elena did not answer. That I cannot tell you. He is not changed by those years. The Dowager Duchess said. He is. Profoundly. But I have watched my son for 5 years fail to find anything in England that made him speak the way he speaks when he talks about you. Not India. Not the work. Not the version of himself that he left there. She stood. With the same unhurried authority with which she had arrived. He refused to sign a document that said a home was nothing because it was inconvenient to those with power. I think you should know that about him. Before he asks you whatever he is building toward asking you, she moved toward the door. At the threshold she paused, which Elena had begun to understand was a habit of the Ashworth family, this pausing at thresholds. Your mother was from Murshidabad. The Dowager Duchess said. The silk there is extraordinary. I have a length of it green. The color of deep water that my husband brought me 30 years ago. I have never found anything to make from it because nothing seemed worthy of the material. She looked at Elena with the gray eyes that were her son's eyes, patient and assessing. I think, perhaps. I have been waiting for the right occasion. She left. Elena sat alone in the library with the company dispatches and her father's absent name and the folded letter on the table and the afternoon light doing its slow work across the floor. She did not open the letter. It was not hers to open, but she looked at it for a long time, and she thought about a man who had stood in a foreign country and refused to sign his name to the idea that a home could be nothing. And she thought about herself standing in Lady Darlington's music room pressing her palm against the glass and telling herself in her mother's language that everything would be all right. She thought, we have been doing the same thing, from different directions. For a very long time, she picked up her pen. She returned to the dispatches. But the afternoon had changed quality. And the absences in the official record looked different now, not like erasures but like spaces that had always been waiting for the correct name. That he found her in the greenhouse. She had gone there in the early evening, when the main house was occupied with the preparations for dinner and the grounds were quiet. The greenhouse in the evening was different from the greenhouse in the afternoon. The outside light had shifted from gold to something more neutral, and inside, the plants made their own small climate. Breathing and unhurried, indifferent to the social proceedings of the house beyond the glass, she was sitting on the stone bench with the wooden box in her lap. She had not intended to bring it. She had brought it anyway. He entered without announcing himself. Which she had learned was his way, not stealth, simply the absence of ceremony. He closed the glass door behind him and looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Your mother told you? Elena said, she told me that she had spoken with you. He came to sit at the other end of the bench, the same configuration as their first afternoon here. The tamarind tree at one end and the neem at the other, and the two of them in between. She didn't tell me what she said. She told me about the treaty. That he was quiet for a moment. I see, you didn't tell me. Know why? He looked at the tamarind tree with the expression she had catalogued from the greenhouse and the ballroom and the garden, the expression of someone checking that something still exists. Because I did not want you to think it was the same thing. What same thing? That refusing to sign that document. And he stopped. Started again. I did not want you to think that what I feel for you is a form of the same principle. A refusal to treat a person as a convenience. He turned to look at her. It isn't. Or rather, it isn't only that. The principle is true. You should not be treated as a convenience. But that is not why I crossed Lady Darlington's music room, or why I can name every plant your mother would have kept in her courtyard. Or why. He stopped. Elena looked at the wooden box in her lap. She opened it, the contact cloth. The pressed flower. The two sealed letters. And the folded sheet of paper with 4 words in Hindi. Worn now at the creases from being unfolded and refolded. Anna Chahi Agar Dil Main, you sent this before you knew me. She said that I knew enough. You knew my father's name in a company dispatch. That I knew that you spoke Hindi to yourself in a room full of people who couldn't hear you. He said it simply, as if this were sufficient, and perhaps, she thought. It was. I knew that you were the only person in that room who was entirely herself. Even in the moment of trying hardest not to be. A pause. I have spent 5 years in rooms full of people performing. I know what performance looks like from the inside. And I know what it looks like when someone is not performing. Even when they believe they are. The greenhouse breathed around them. The tulsi. The imli. The stubborn neem. That I have been afraid, Elena said. That I am a shape that fits a space you lost. That India is the space and I am something that reminds you of it, and that when the resemblance fades. Elena. He said her name without the honorific, and it sounded different, closer. Like something he had been waiting for permission to do. Look at me, she looked that I know what I lost when I was recalled. He said. I know its precise dimensions. I have lived with it for 5 years. He held her gaze with the grey monsoon eyes. You are not its shape. You are not its substitute. You are. He paused. With the deliberateness of someone who knows that the next sentence will not be retractable and is choosing it accordingly, the only person I have met since I returned home who made me feel that what is real can also be here. Not there. Not in the past. Here, Elena held the wooden box. Inside it. Her mother's kanta, the pressed flower, the unsent letters, and the note that had brought her here. That I need to tell you something. She said, tell me. When I said Shanti Rocco to myself in Lady Darlington's room, she stopped. It is the last thing my mother said to me. She died when I was 14. Those were her last clear words. I have been saying them to myself every day for 10 years because it is the only way I can still hear her voice. She looked at the kanta cloth. When you answered Muhen you spoke, and I understood that you had heard. She stopped again. She felt him receive this. The quality of his stillness changed. She gave you a way to stand, he said. Echoing what she had told him in the garden without knowing she had told him, she gave me a way to stand. Elena confirmed that he was quiet for a long moment. Then, I would like to ask you something. I would like to ask it properly. He reached into his coat and produced a small objector ring, simple. A dark green stone in a plain gold setting, nothing elaborate. The ring of someone who had chosen for meaning rather than display. This was my grandmother's. She lived for 40 years in a house that did not entirely suit her and made it into something that did. I think she would have understood you. Elena looked at the ring. Kia tum muj shadi kurogi. He said. Will you marry me? And then, in English, with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything, I am asking in both languages because I want to be completely clear that I am asking all of you. Not the English half. Not the Indian half. All of you, as you are. Which is the only version I have ever been interested in. Elena looked at the ring and the man holding it and the greenhouse around them with its impossible plants surviving their wrong climate through sheer stubborn insistence on existing. She thought about her mother, who had taught her to read in 2 languages so she would always have a place to stand. She thought about her father, whose name had been absent from the official record for 20 years, who had made something precise and useful and true. She thought about herself at 14. Standing in a courtyard in Calcutta, hearing her mother's voice for the last time, learning the sentence that would keep her alive for the next decade in a city that did not know what to do with her. Shanti Rocco. Sab Thik Haga, you have to ask properly. She said. On your knee. That he looked at her. Something moved in his expression, the movement toward a smile that she had learned to recognize, the thing that happened in his face when he was genuinely, unperformatively pleased. That he went to one knee on the greenhouse floor, which was stone and slightly damp and entirely indifferent to the dignity of dukes. Kia tum muj shadi kurogi, he said again. Will you marry me? Elena Valentine, daughter of Thomas Valentine, whose maps were true. Daughter of a woman from Murshidabad who knew how to stand in 2 places at once. Will you stay? Elena looked down at him. Outside the glass walls, England continued its grey and composed proceedings. Inside, the tamarind was being stubborn and the tulsi was growing and the neem had opinions about its situation and was surviving anyway. Han, she said. Yes. And then, because he had asked in both languages. Yes, that he stood. He placed the ring on her finger with the careful precision of someone handling something that mattered. And then she was in his arms and the wooden box was somehow still in her hands and neither of them said anything for a while because the greenhouse was already saying its smell of earth and cardamom and something green and alive, the warmth of an impossible climate sustained by stubbornness and care, 2 languages living in the same air without requiring one to defeat the other. After a while he said, against her hair. Shanti Rocco, not as a question. As a promise. Elena closed her eyes and held the wooden box and felt, for the first time since she was 14 years old, that everything was going to be all right because it actually was, not because she was telling herself so in the dark. Sab Thik Haga. She thought, and meant it. The wedding was held in the village church at the edge of the Ashdown estate, in the second week of October. When the English countryside had committed itself to autumn with the wholehearted conviction it brought to all its seasonal transitions, Elena had not expected to feel anything in particular about the church. It was an English church. Old stone and clear glass and the smell of cold and candle wax and centuries of other people's significant occasions. She had stood in English rooms for 5 years without feeling that they belonged to her or she to them. She had expected this to be the same. Only louder. She had been wrong. Standing at the entrance while the organ found its opening notes, Elena held her uncle's arm and looked at the length of the nave and understood, with the particular clarity that arrives sometimes without warning, that what she was feeling was not belonging to the room. It was something more specific and more useful. She was bringing herself into the room, all of herself. And the room was simply the room. Her gown was ivory silk. The ivory comb her mother's was in her hair. At her throat was a length of green Murshidabad silk, not made into anything elaborate, simply folded and pinned, the way her mother had worn fabric at celebrations. The Dowager Duchess had brought it to her the previous morning without ceremony, placed it on the dressing table, and said, "I thought now was the right occasion." Then she had left. Which Elena had come to understand was how the Ashworth family expressed the things they found difficult to say at full volume. James was at the altar, that he was looking at her in the way he had looked at her across Lady Darlington's music room, across the greenhouse, across the ballroom, with the grey eyes that had seen the monsoon and the Hughley River and the tamarind tree in its proper climate, and had then, somehow, found their way to her. He was not performing composure. He simply was composed, in the way of a man who has decided something and found, in the deciding, a stillness he had not previously possessed. She walked toward him, and the organ played, and the October light came through the clear glass windows and did nothing cruel at all. The reception was held in the great hall of Ashdown Park, which had been transformed by flowers and candlelight into something that managed to be simultaneously impressive and warm, a combination Elena had come to associate with things that James arranged when he was paying attention. She stood in the receiving line for 2 hours, learning the names and faces and degrees of connection of 140 people, most of whom she had not met and would need to meet again and remember. James stood beside her throughout, occasionally providing a quiet word of context when the complexity of a connection required it. It was, she realized, the most sustained conversation they had ever had, running, quiet, punctuated by the necessary pleasantries of the line, a continuous low-voiced exchange in the negative space between greetings. At the 100th guest, Lady Fontaine arrived. She came with Cecily, who had married a viscount in August and appeared to be managing the fact of Elena's existence with the equanimity of someone who had moved on to other concerns. Cecily curtsied correctly and offered a sentence about happiness that sounded, to Elena's ear, like it had been meant. She passed through without incident. Lady Fontaine curtsied. The curtsy was correct. Everything about Lady Fontaine was always correct, which was its own form of message. "Your Grace," she said. The title sat in her mouth with the quality of something she was carrying carefully so as not to drop it. Lady Fontaine. Elena received the curtsy with the composure she had learned over a summer. Was not performance but simply the accumulation of knowing who she was. "How good of you to come." A pause. Around them, the receiving line continued its patient progress. James was 3 feet away, engaged with a neighboring landowner. But Elena was aware of his attention in the peripheral way she had become aware of it over the past months, the way you become aware of a fixed point. "You look." Lady Fontaine stopped. Looked. With the assessing eyes that had catalogued Elena's deficiencies in Lady Darlington's music room and every room since. "Well," she finished. The word had, somehow, more in it than its single syllable should have contained. "Thank you," Elena said. Another pause. Lady Fontaine's eyes moved briefly to the green silk at Elena's throat, to the ivory comb, to the ring on her hand with its dark stone. "That I said things," Lady Fontaine said, at a volume calibrated for Elena alone, "that were unkind. More than unkind." She was not performing regret. Performing regret was something Lady Fontaine was entirely capable of, and this was not it. This was the flatter, less comfortable thing that sits underneath performance when the performance has been set aside. I find I have been revising my understanding of several matters, this year. Elena looked at her. The woman who had stood in the drawing room and implied that Elena's blood was a social liability. That her presence was a cost to be managed, that the appropriate response to her existence was strategic removal. My husband has a posting in Bengal. Lady Fontaine said. He wrote to me in August. He said she stopped. He said the survey maps are the most accurate documentation he has worked with in 15 years of company service. He asked if I knew the name of the surveyor. A pause. I knew the name. The receiving line moved. That I hope. Lady Fontaine said, that his work is published. Fully attributed. She curtsied again, the second curtsy smaller and somehow more real than the first. Your Grace, she moved on. Elena watched her go. The great hall continued its celebrations around her. Candlelight and voices and the smell of good food, and somewhere in the musician's corner, the beginning of a reel. James appeared at her elbow with the quiet accuracy of someone who had been watching and had timed his arrival. Lady Fontaine, he said. Not a question, she knew my father's name. Elena said. By the end, people generally do. When they decide to look. Elena watched Lady Fontaine navigate the room with the careful dignity of a woman reconstructing something. She thought about what it cost to say I have been revising my understanding. She thought about the 100 small revisions her own understanding had undergone since. A man had spoken Hindi to her across a crowded room and everything had changed its axis. Maafi dina theek hota hai, she said quietly. More to herself than to him. It is right to forgive, Han. He offered her his arm. Or aage badna bhi. And also to move forward. She took his arm. The reel had started. The hall was full of light. 2 years later. The schoolroom was finished. It occupied what had been a disused outbuilding at the east edge of the estate, a stone structure with large windows that James had commissioned to be enlarged so that the light came in from 2 sides. Inside, 12 small desks, a large table for maps. Shelves of books in 3 languages, and a globe that showed the full extent of the world without privileging any particular point upon it as center. Elena had spent the summer arranging it and the autumn filling it. The children came from the estate's tenant families and from the village, and as word had spread in the way that useful things spread, from rather further afield. Some were the children of company men who had returned from India with families they did not quite know how to explain to the English countryside. Some were simply children who had ended up, by the accidents of birth and circumstance, between languages, between places, belonging completely to neither, and therefore, Elena had come to understand. Available to belong to both, she taught Hindi and Bengali on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. She taught English history and Indian geography on alternating afternoons. She taught mathematics with the systematic pleasure of someone who had learned from a father who believed that precision was a form of respect for the world. On Friday afternoons, which she had designated as unstructured, the children read anything they liked from the shelves, or drew. Or her preferred outcome argued about things with the productive energy of people who had discovered that they had opinions worth having. On a Thursday in November, 3 months after the school had opened, a new child arrived. She was brought by her grandmother, who spoke no English and stood in the doorway of the schoolroom with the expression of someone who has made a long journey and is not entirely certain they have arrived at the correct destination. The child was perhaps 10 years old. Small and dark and wearing the expression of someone who has learned to make herself inconspicuous. The particular stillness of a child who has understood that being noticed is not always safe. Her name was Priya. She was from Calcutta. Her father had come to England for company business and died of fever in his second winter, and her mother had died a year later. And her grandmother had brought her to England because the English family who had some claim on her father's estate had offered, grudgingly, to accommodate them. Elena recognized the stillness. She recognized the calculus behind the eyes. The continuous monitoring of every room. She crossed the schoolroom and crouched down to the child's level, which put them eye to eye, and she said, in Hindi, with her mother's particular way of curving around the consonants. Shanti Rako. Sab Theek Haga. Priya looked at her. The stillness did not break all at once. It broke the way ice breaks in spring, not a dramatic shattering but a slow release, 1 degree at a time. As the temperature changes and the thing that had been rigid begins to remember that it was once water. The child's shoulders came down, a fraction. Her breath deepened, slightly. Her eyes, which had been doing their careful work of assessment, softened at the edges. Aap Hindi Janti Hain. She said, very quietly. You know Hindi, Han? Elena smiled. Yes. I learned it from my mother. She was from Murshidabad. She used to say this to me, when I was frightened. She paused. You can say it to yourself, too. When you need to. Any time. In any room. Priya looked at her for a long moment with the serious, measuring attention of a child who has learned to be careful about what she trusts, then she nodded. Once, small, decided, thick high. She said. All right. Elena showed her to a desk. She gave her a notebook, good paper, the kind that took ink without bleeding, and a pen, and a grammar book in Hindi with the English translations written in the margins in Elena's own handwriting. Small and precise. She showed her where the maps were and told her she was welcome to look at any of them, including the ones on the bottom shelf, which were her father's original survey documents, now published by the Asiatic Society and attributed, fully and correctly, to Thomas George Valentine. Surveyor, East India Company, 1805 to 1813. The other children had been watching with the frank curiosity of people who had not yet learned to disguise their interest. Now they returned to their work. And the room settled into the particular productive quiet of a space that knows what it is for. Elena stood at the front of the room and watched. She was aware, in the way she had become aware of fixed points, that James was at the doorway, that he had come from the estate office, apparently. Because he was still carrying a sheaf of papers. He stood in the opening and looked at the room, at the 12 desks and the maps and the globe, and the children bent over their notebooks, and then at Elena, with the grey eyes that had seen so many things and had somehow, against all the structural logic of the world they lived in, managed to find their way here. She crossed the room to him. He made space for her in the doorway, and they stood together looking at the schoolroom, and neither of them said anything. Because the room was already saying its scratch of pens on good paper, the small concentrated sounds of children learning, the Thursday afternoon light falling through the enlarged windows onto desks that held books in 3 languages, the globe that had no center. I in the corner. Priya was copying something from the grammar book into her notebook. Her handwriting was careful and deliberate, the handwriting of someone who understood that putting words on paper was a way of making them real. Shanti Rocco, Elena said, very quietly, not to anyone in particular. Or perhaps to everyone. James did not say I know. He did not say yes. He took her hand in the doorway of the schoolroom, and held it with the steady warmth of someone who intended to continue holding it for a considerable time. And the Thursday light came through the windows and fell on the desks and the maps and the notebooks, and Priya wrote her careful words, and the tamarind tree in the greenhouse 30 meters away was being its usual stubborn self. And outside the schoolroom the November grounds of Ashdown Park went about their quiet business under a sky that was grey and particular and entirely itself. Sab Thik Haga, everything is all right, not because she was telling herself so in the dark. With her palm pressed flat against cold glass, trying to survive another afternoon in a room that did not know what to do with her, because it was